Church, where the Anglican Women's Studies Council and Links are meeting for the weekend. So we're really enjoying being in a different place. And it's my great pleasure this evening to welcome Jennifer Lewis, whom I heard about a month ago, I guess it was, or 6 weeks maybe, giving a lecture while she was in Auckland. And I thought it was so stunning that I was very glad when you agreed to come back and talk to us again, Jennifer. So Jennifer has spent quite a bit of time in New Zealand. She was at St Andrew's Taupo for 3 years in family and children's ministry. She spent 2 months, lucky person, at Vaughan Park in Auckland, and then recently was at St John's Theological College in Auckland again as a visiting scholar. She's a PhD candidate at Boston University, but is currently in Colorado, where she's talking to us tonight from. And it's 1 o'clock in the morning for Jennifer. And it's wonderful that she's prepared to be here at that terrible time. So we really, really appreciate you being here, Jennifer. Jennifer has a particular interest in Julian of Norwich, and the title for her talk tonight is Contemplative, Feminist and Faithful, Creating Contemplative Learning Communities with Julian of Norwich. And our usual procedure is for the speaker to speak for 20 or 30 minutes, and then other people are welcome to share their experiences or any questions after that. So, as I said, it's a great pleasure to welcome you, Jennifer, and I'll hand it over to you. And I just suggest that everybody else mutes their screens, just so that we don't get any background noise, and I'll do the same.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sarah Dwin, and just all of you for joining me this evening, or allowing me to join you. It really is such a gift to be in communion with the Anglican Church of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I, as Sarah Dwin mentioned, have some deep roots in this church, and particularly the community of Taupo and St Andrews. And I see one lovely face on screen who was there when I was there and remains, yeah, just a good friend in ministry. So thank you. It's just such a joy to be with you. And as Sarah Dwin mentioned, my title for the talk this evening is Contemplative, Feminist and Faithful, Creating Contemplative Communities with Julian of Norwich. So I'll just begin right here, and if at any point I have a lot of material, so I may skip through, and feel free to ask me questions after I finish about anything that you would love clarification on or to discuss further. So, in the year 1373, a devout woman by the name of Julian of Norwich received a series of divine showings about the nature of God's love. The visions came at an unexpected hour. Julian was on her deathbed in a state of severe suffering after becoming critically ill just a week before. But the visions were also unexpected gifts. While Julian had not requested visions from God, she had prayed in her youth for a wound of deep longing and even bodily sickness, so that she might know more deeply the love of God in his passion. But still, Julian was not ready to die, and as she approached what she thought were the last minutes of her life, all her pain suddenly left her, and she saw 16 different visions, all reflecting some aspect of God's love for humankind. As you would expect, this experience was life-altering. Julian would go on to contemplate the showings for at least 20 years, and what she saw reshaped her theology and formed her vocationally and personally. Not only would she write 2 theological accounts of her experiences, but Julian would also take up a religious vocation as an anchoress, as well as step into more dangerous vocations as a woman writer, a theologian and teacher, roles that were very much out of step with the religious and social expectations of the 14th century. So I realize Julian's story might strike us as a bit strange. She is in many ways a mystic and a woman of her time. A time, of course, very different than our own. And yet in our time together this evening, I want to walk with this 14th century woman, Julian of Norwich. I want to consider what her writings and the experience of contemplation that they describe can teach us about women's contemplative practices and the theological reflection and formation that they affect. So feminist scholars underscore that women's processes of faith formation and spiritualities often look different than their male counterparts. And in many cases, mysticism and contemplation serve as critical resources for women in their quest to open up and examine the faith they have received, to contest religious ideas and rituals that can suppress women's voices, and to create new ways of talking about God and practicing faith. So mysticism and contemplation is really critical resources for women. So what can Julian teach us about women's contemplative practices? And how might she help us reconceive contemplation in a feminist form, a form that can support women in claiming their theological voices and distinct contributions as leaders? How might she help us think about creating contemplative and feminist communities? So this is what I want to think about a bit in the remainder of our time together. So a bit of a roadmap. I'll start by briefly discussing contemplation within the wider Christian tradition. This will be brief and not comprehensive, but really emphasizing the importance of looking to women's spiritual writings as we think about contemplative practices today. And then I'll look and consider some of the distinctives of Julian's contemplative practice with a particular attention to some feminist themes. And finally, I'll lift up a few implications as we consider how we might build contemplative communities that support women in claiming their theological voices and their vocations as women leaders. So contemplation. For much of Christian history, contemplation has been seen as a way of practicing presence to God, a seeing and seeking to be with God in a firsthand way. So in the period of early monasticism, contemplation was often associated with the life of prayer. So it was a resting in God as opposed to speaking with God. And then as Christianity developed, contemplation, the contemplative life, became connected to mysticism, which was a way of seeking to know God within the context of religious experience. And both contemplation and mystical experience emphasized that it was possible to know God in an intimate and personal way, and that the goal of seeking such knowledge was union with God. So it's just a bit of contemplation historically. In contemporary times, of course, right, contemplation has received diverse definitions. Maria Lickman describes contemplation as seeing the sacred in everything. Walter Burkhardt speaks of contemplation as a long, loving look at the real. Thomas Keating calls contemplative prayer, quote, a conversation initiated by God and leading, if we consent, to divine union. So again, these are just a handful of definitions, and characteristic of all of them is right, this desire to see God, to experience a kind of intimacy with the divine in a firsthand experiential way. And at the same time, I would argue that these definitions do not necessarily convey the diversity and distinctiveness that characterize women's contemplative practices, nor do they reflect the way contemplation has often served as a liberative and prophetic practice for women, a means by which they have reconnected with their inner wisdom, claimed their roles as religious leaders, and forged new ways and more inclusive forms of God talk. In fact, the characteristics I see as often associated with contemplation, right? So things like silence and solitude, detachment, emptiness, kenosis, moderation of passion and stillness, can in some ways actually become oppressive for women, forms that can hold them back from fully expressing themselves and their voices in a world that would otherwise wish them to stay silent. So I think taking a feminist perspective can actually begin to help address some of these generalizations and really enable the creation of contemplative practices that put women back in touch with God in ways that empower them in their vocations as women leaders and theologians. Feminist theologians underscore particularly looking to women's lives, experiences, and narratives as the starting point for reconstructing theological discourse and religious practices. So for a long time, women's histories and perspective have just simply been relegated to the margins of history or erased from its canons altogether. And so I think Feminist theologians emphasize returning to women's experiences across history, cultures, and geographic spaces, in part because it enables us to resist this kind of silencing and also to find rich resources for our own spiritual lives and ministries. When it comes to contemplation, I think the spiritual writings of women are some of the most important developed resources that we actually have on women's contemplative practices. And in looking at such writings, especially those of the medieval period when Julian was living and writing, we find that contemplation and mystical firsthand experiences of God actually served as profoundly empowering pathways for women in their quest to know God, claim their vocations as religious leaders, and to develop new theological ideas and language. And this is very much true of Julian. Her texts relay a decades-long practice of contemplation and contemplative inquiring that reshaped her theology, as I mentioned, leading her to expand the God images and theological language of her day, as well as to offer provocative theological reflections on topics that were central to the Christian faith and society. So things like salvation and sin and the body and eschatology. And at the same time, in the course of receiving the visions and contemplating them for 20 years, I would argue Julian also awakens to herself and the goodness of her being and the goodness of creation. She claims her calling as a theologian and a writer, both of which were, again, very much out of step with the religious expectations and roles in the 14th century. All that to say, or to ask rather, what can Julian's contemplative practice teach us then about contemplation today, especially contemplation that empowers women to claim their voices and callings, as well as generate new language and images for the divine? So in the next few minutes, I want to explore 3 features of Julian's contemplative practice, doing so from a feminist perspective and with a view towards possibilities for our own context. I want to just, emphasize that Julian is just one voice, right, among many women contemplatives, and cannot speak for all of them. And yet I still think her writings offer a valuable starting point for thinking about how to create empowering contemplative spaces for women today. So 3 features of Julian's contemplative knowing. First, relational. So when many of us may think of contemplation, what often can come to mind is silence. So a quieting of the self and our inner dialogues in order to seek God. And I think silence, of course, can be really positive. Quieting the mind and stilling one's thoughts can allow a depth of presence to God and to self that is not always possible, right, in the hustle and bustle of everyday life. And yet, when we look at Julian's writings, we notice something a bit different. Rather than silencing her inner thoughts in order to focus on God, Julian engages in this ongoing, lively exchange with God, not only during the time of the showings, but for the 2 decades following. Indeed, her texts are full of showings as well as speakings, dialogues with God, and honest debates. And it is this dynamic dialogue with God in the space of contemplation that comes to shape what Julian sees in the visions, as well as the theological meanings at which she arrives in the years to come. So in other words, Julian's beholding and contemplating God is relational and vocal, energized by an ongoing dialogue rooted in deep love and mutuality and trust. And at the same time, Julian's encounter with God is not just relationally one-sided, with Julian doing all the contemplating and dialoguing. Again and again, in the course of beholding God, Julian experiences herself beheld and engaged by God. She describes how Christ sees and speaks with her, with compassion and kindness, with joy and courtesy, continuous delight and familiar love. Julian recounts one such experience. Quote, she says, "Then the good Lord put a question to me. Are you well satisfied that I suffered for you? I said, yes, good Lord. All my thanks to you. Yes, good Lord, blessed may you be. Then Jesus, our good Lord, said, if you are satisfied, I am satisfied. It is a joy, a bliss, an endless delight to me that I ever suffered my passion for you. And if I could suffer more, I should suffer more. you can feel the intimacy, mutuality, and trust, right, that pulsates through Julian's contemplative practice. And it's this context of relational security and affirmation of being beheld and loved by God that I think affords Julian the inner confidence and courage that she would have required to vocalize her visions and to risk writing her theological reflections on them. Again, in a time period where women were not permitted to do these things. So scholars of feminist spirituality emphasize that supportive, equitable, and compassionate relationships are really critical to women's vocational journeys and theological formation. Ruth Floyd, in an essay called Telling My Story, describes how relationships provided a critical support in her journey from a place of nothingness and alienation from God to a place of self-acceptance and love. She writes, quote, "How did I get from the tightly closed bud to a fully open blossom, ready to face whatever the world had to offer? I wish I knew. What I can do is share my story. That is how I learned God's love. Nobody told me, or at least I never heard the words, but people showed me. They loved me while I hurt." I think we see this with Julian. In her writings, contemplation becomes a relational practice, a space of liberation and authentic expression, a space in which she could be seen and appreciated in her fullness in ways not offered by her society or church. Women in Julian's day, as I mentioned, as well as before and for many, many years afterwards, were not permitted to teach theology, to exercise pastoral authority, or express their religious perspectives. Contemplation, however, provided Julian an assurance of God's love, an experience of relational presence and compassion that not only allowed her to ask challenging questions about church teachings or to develop new theological understandings of sin, salvation, creation, human nature. It also created a womb space by which she could become fully alive, connected with her inner wisdom as a woman and her calling as a theologian, born again in a role of leadership and proclamation that otherwise was denied to her. So that was the first feature I see in Julian's contemplative inquiry. The second thing we notice about Julian's contemplative practice is attention to suffering, both her own suffering and the suffering of God, as well as the suffering of the world. So as I mentioned in the introduction, Julian received her showings at the height of what she believed to be a mortal illness. Feminist scholar Nicholas Lee argues that experiences of personal and social suffering are often the first step in women's theological and spiritual formation. In her study of women's processes of faithing, Lee describes how many of the women that she spoke with felt alienated from God, half alive or in a state of spiritual impasse. And this alienation, which was often connected to experiences of suffering and social limitation, preceded this journey of coming alive or awake. So Julian's contemplative knowing begins precisely in this place of pain and limitation. So deep in pain and agony, she describes how her body slowly begins to expire. She writes, quote, "The upper part of my body began to die until I could scarcely feel anything. This in turn puts pressure on her chest and throat. She can barely breathe or lift her head, is really what happens." And so like Slee's descriptions of the women that she studied, Julian's experience is somewhat like one of being half alive. And as a woman in the 14th century, this sense of half aliveness would only have been compounded by sexism and suppression. And yet, rather than an obstacle to her contemplative practice, Julian's physical pain, as well as her closeness to the pain of silence in which many women lived and still do, Julian's physical pain becomes this ground zero, right, for a revelatory encounter with the divine. And in her pain, she beholds a co-suffering God whose wounds are expression of solidarity and deep love for humanity. And she also beholds a God who beholds her with love, with compassion, a God who is capable of alleviating not only her pain, but the pain of the world. So Julian's personal suffering in this sense is really a catalyst for her contemplation, is where I'm going, an experience that offers insight into the presence and possibilities of a God whose suffering love brings healing and hope. And so this leads to the second kind of suffering that Julian contemplates, namely the suffering of Christ in the Passion. So Julian describes the very first vision that she receives in which she beholds Christ's passion. Quote, "I saw the blood running down from under the crown, hot and flowing copiously and freely, a living stream, just as it was when the crown of thorns was pressed upon his blessed head." She goes on to describe this vision and really of Christ's body just dying slowly, under the pain of the crucifixion. And this is the first glimpse that Julian has of God. So as a God wounded and in pain, whose blood is plentiful and flowing freely to all like a living stream, reviving humanity. Elaine Graham writes that a feminist theological perspective emphasizes, quote, "the vulnerability of God through the suffering of Christ, and identifies the exclusion of the poor and marginalized as experiences through which justice and redemption will be established." And this is true for Julian's contemplative practice. And in fact, it is this vision of Christ's suffering that forms the interpretive center of all of her theology. She tells us later that everything she beholds and learns of God and the life of faith is filtered through Jesus's wounds. And yet Christ's suffering and Julian's suffering, right, those are the two I've mentioned so far, are not the only suffering around. On the contrary, Julian is contemplating the showings in God in a world that is in many respects splitting at the seams. In her lifetime, she would witness a global pandemic, or experience rather, with 3 separate waves of the Black Plague sweeping through Norwich. She would witness religious division and violence, both in her home country of England and abroad. She would have felt the effects of famine and economic pressures. She would have heard stories of the peasants' revolt down the street and their violent suppression at the hands of the Bishop of Norwich. She would have lived down the road from the pit where those deemed to be heretics, most notably followers of John Wycliffe, would have been burned. And on top of that, Julian would have lived in a religious and social context that did not value women, their bodies, or their leadership. So a lot going on, right? A lot of social suffering, in some ways, probably reminiscent of some of the times that we live in. So feminist scholars have long argued that the personal is always political. And I would argue that we see this overlap of the personal and political in Julian, particularly in relation to our presence to pain. So we don't have time to unpack the theological ideas Julian brings to birth in the context of her contemplative beholding. But what she sees of God's love is really mediated by her attentiveness to social suffering. And in her contemplation, she starts to behold God differently and in ways that run counter to the theological doctrines of her day. Julian sees a God who does not see sin or blame humanity for their experience of frailty and fallenness. She sees a God of deep courtesy and acceptance, who is near and not distant. She sees a God whose mercy is like a mother's, a God whose wound becomes like a mother's womb, enclosing all people in itself so humanity can be born again. And each of these theological discoveries would have spoken a word of hope and healing to Julian's community, and reminds us that her comments, "all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well," is more than just a kind of trite spiritual bypassing. It's really wrestling with the deep suffering of the world in connection to the suffering of God that she sees in the cross. So finally, Julian's contemplative practice, as kind of a last point of reflection and distinctiveness, is deeply imaginative, embodied, and full of passion. So in reading Julian's writings, one is struck again and again by the way that she draws upon her imagination and embodied experiences to interpret the showings. As early as the first vision, Julian uses language of clothing to describe the closeness of God's love. Quote, "I saw that he is to us everything which is good and comforting for our help. He is our clothing, who wraps and enfolds us for his love, embraces us and shelters us." So here God is described as clothing that enfolds us, a shelter surrounding and protecting us in love. And then a few sentences later, literally, Julian describes the love of God for creation through the image of a hazelnut. Many of us might know this image. Julian describes God showing her something small, no bigger than a hazelnut, lying in the palm of her hand. And she wonders, what can this be? and is amazed really that it could last, she says, because it was so little and it would have fallen into nothing. And she says, I quote, "I was answered in my understanding. It lasts and always will because God loves it. And thus everything is being through the love of God." So here creation, through though small as a hazelnut, is preserved by the steady upholding of God's love. And this is really, I mean, I don't have time here. Her text is just replete with images and metaphors. So God is a familiar and courteous Lord hosting a banquet, a mother who encloses us in herself. And in the most famous section of Julian's text, God is depicted as a servant who sets out to do the bidding of a great Lord, and then falls in a ditch by no fault of his own. And this becomes a metaphor and parable for our salvation and God's rescuing of us from this ditch, and Christ's solidarity with us in the pain of human experience. And so we have many of these images become really the basis for Julian's most innovative and daring theological thinking. So new ways of visualizing God beyond the doctrinal boundaries of the church. And yet, just as Julian's contemplation is enriched by her imagination, so it is also equally resourced by her embodied experience as a woman. And she draws upon this experience in ways that really recenter and affirm women's bodies as a medium for theological reflection. And I think the clearest example of this is Julian's description of Christ as our, quote, kind, KYND, mother in faith. So while describing Christ as a mother was not itself new, others had done this, Julian really develops that image in ways that go well beyond what her male counterparts have offered. Specifically in choosing to use this word kind, KYND, to describe Christ's motherhood, a word which was primarily used in Julian's day to describe women's nature and their reproductive capacities. Julian joins Christ's nature to women's nature. For Julian, Christ is our mother, a woman in whom we are enclosed and from whom we are rebirthed and nurtured into fullness of salvation. So in this sense, Julian is really making women's bodies, or women's kind, the foundational image by which to depict Christ's identity and salvific mission. So whether or not Julian herself was a mother, we don't know. It is really clear that she is drawing on her bodily and social experience as a woman to become a means by which she probes the meaning of the visions. And begins to articulate their theological implications. So again, she's drawing on her embodied experience. She's drawing on her imagination. And both imagination and experience are something really central to feminist theology. And feminist theologians underscore the importance of developing new images and languages for God, especially images rooted in and inclusive of women's embodied experiences. For many women, the implicit and explicit images and language they've inherited from their church communities or in tradition have been predominantly hierarchical, masculine, or just inconsistent with women's lived experiences. This isn't always the case, but is true in a kind of large sense. And in Julian's contemplative practice, imagination and attention to women's bodies and experiences serve as means by which to rewrite the theological scripts and symbols of her day, and to develop images that offer more inclusive and expansive understandings of God. So again, the body and imagination is really critical resources in Julian's contemplative practice. So that was a bit of a speed through, but so I think at this point we've explored, or I've tried to lift up some key characteristics of Julian's contemplative practice, characteristics that might seem to run counter to dominant ideas of contemplation, characteristics I am subtly implying are both feminist and faithful. Yet how, practically speaking, might Julian's contemplative practice help us as leaders create contemplative spaces and communities that empower women to claim both their theological voices and their vocations, especially in contexts where doing so not only requires courage, but sometimes audacity and genuine faith in the affirming call of God. So I'm going to just speed through these points, and we can come back to them as you want and think would be helpful. But I think the first is practicing presence to pain. So contemplative practice, Julian teaches us, is first and foremost about staying present to places of pain. As we saw above, bodies, wounded bodies, are really the first text that Julian contemplates. She sees Christ's wounded body exposed and dying, even as she feels her own body dying. And she contemplates the death and suffering that surrounds her, the pain of plague, of oppression, economic anxiety, and violence. So suffering is all around, and Julian is contemplating it. Maria Lickman, in describing contemplation, writes that it involves an ethic of presence. For many women, I think wounds are often the greatest obstacles to our sense of union with God and neighbor, and especially connection with ourselves. And at the same time, what we see in Julian, as well as other feminist writers, is that wounds are the first place that God shows up, as well as the criterion by which love is measured. And staying close to suffering, being present to it, our own suffering, as well as the suffering of others, Julian teaches us, the path towards understanding the extent and possibility of God's love. So what would it look like to practice a contemplative ethic of presence in our communities and leadership? A presence that holds space for wounds and pain, allowing them to be seen and honored without needing to be immediately resolved. I think Julian reminds us that we should refuse to look away. And in doing so, we become one with Christ, who became one with us in suffering. By staying present to pain, we can create, I think, contemplative spaces where harm and oppression can be healed and where new liberating visions of God can begin to grow. Second, the sources I think that we draw in contemplative practice must be rooted in our bodies, embodied experiences as women. So Julian teaches us that contemplative practice and beholding really engages the whole body. So it's sensory and physical capacities, its emotional range in the search to discern and be present to God. I think for so many women, our sexualities and embodiment have been sources of shame and suspicion. And our emotional intelligence and sensitivities have been treated as liabilities. So Julian reminds us, I think, that contemplation, if it is to be a means towards authentic unity, must really honor the integrity and wisdom within our experiences as women. So in designing and creating contemplative spaces and communities, I think we must engage deeply our lived realities as women and our bodily experiences in the world. So really centering those in contemplative practice. Third, I think Julian teaches us that contemplative inquiring is really profoundly imaginative, bearing fruit in multiply expansive and inclusive images, metaphors, descriptors, and concepts of God. So I've already talked about feminist theologians' kind of emphases on the role that images and language play in our conceptions of God and the church. Really, Nicholas Lee writes, images and metaphors, I love this quote, just they form the building blocks of theology. So they're so central to how we think and talk about God. They're the prisms through which all perception is refracted. And I think Julian reminds us, right, that contemplative practice can and must help women devise new images, language, metaphors for God, ones that speak to the full range of their experiences as women, and create new possibilities for others around them. And finally, I think relationships. So as we saw, Julian's theological insights, wisdom, and sense of voice and vocation really emerge within a relational context of trust, mutuality, and love. I think such relationships are really vital for creating contemplative spaces today, especially for women and other minoritized groups who have often experienced silence and stillness as forms of oppression. So to claim one's voice requires, right, that one be in touch with it. And yet the safety afforded by silence can often be more appealing than the risk of coming into speech. I really want to emphasize and underscore the importance, I think, of relationships in contemplative practice. It's not something that's often lifted up, but I think it's really central to how Julian contemplates. So one researcher in a study on women's voice work describes the difficulty women faced in speaking. She writes, sometimes in the face of systemic oppression, the women in the study clung to silence, thereby hiding much of ourselves from the world, and sometimes, because it would have been too crazy-making to do otherwise, hiding parts of ourselves. In silence, there were rewards. We were less vulnerable to criticism, censure, and to the losses that often accompany the breaking of social rules. Silence rendered us invisible. And yet the researcher goes on to say that this study revealed all of the participants decided that the costs of remaining silent were too great. So they wanted to become visible and accountable, powerful in the world. I think contemplative spaces. So there's this challenge of being of coming into voice, and feminist theologians will often talk about the experience, Nell Morton calls it, of being heard into speech. I think contemplative spaces, when they are nourished by relationships of trust and mutuality and support, can really offer women an opportunity to emerge from this silence, to be heard into speech, to claim their voices and take up rhetorical and theological space. What we see in Julian and her writings is that the intimacy and oneness of God that she experienced in contemplation really become the nourishment for her sense of value and purpose, the soil out of which her courage to communicate her theological wisdom really could grow. So in creating contemplative spaces, a feminist conception of contemplative knowing, I think, will be relational, it will be communal and profoundly caring. It will prioritize mutuality and appreciation, really, so that women can emerge from silence, find their voices and their callings. So in closing, I just want to propose, I want to propose that Julian's writings really offer us a fresh vision of contemplation. So one that is not necessarily silent or kenotic, tempered or solitary, but deeply rooted in the body and relationships, full of imagination and passion and profoundly generative, giving birth to new theological images, ideas, and possibilities for women leaders. In other words, I think her writings offer us a vision of contemplation that is feminist and faithful. And such a feminist contemplative practice looks like encouraging people to stay present to pain as the starting point for hope. It looks like creating relational spaces capable of sustaining this kind of presence. It looks like forging opportunities for people to draw on their embodied experiences, imaginations, and social contexts to devise new and more liberating language for God and ways of being church. And finally, it looks like nurturing spaces in which women can break the silence, express their theological voices, and claim their vocations as surely and powerfully as Julian did. Thanks.
Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for that and for your lovely, clear outline. Made it very, I was lucky to hear you once before, and this has really reinforced it. And so, yeah, thank you so much for what you've said, and all the other writers that you've quoted, and I can see people have been writing down names and things too. I must find out a bit more about that person.
Yeah.
So at this point, if you'd like to speak, please just physically raise your hand, and I will see that. Or else just use the yellow hand down at the bottom of your screen where it says reactions. You can raise a hand there if you want to. And we've got a whole lot of women here in person in our lovely little community. So some of them may well want to come and ask a question as well. So does anybody want to start off? It's always hard being first. So I had something I wrote down which struck me, and I just wondered if you'd like to expand on it. You were quoting somebody and you said the experience of suffering for women is often the first stage of theological growth.
Yeah.
So who were you quoting or referring to that?
Yeah, so that's Nicholas Lee, who is a feminist theologian out of the UK. And she has a really excellent book, and it was one of the first ones that was done on women's faith formation. And it's called, I think, Women's Processes of Faith Formation, something like that. I have it in the other room, but it's excellent. And it really, she looks at a case, she interviews 30 women about their experiences of faith formation. And she's really in conversation with one of the kind of dominant scholars, James Fowler, on processes of faith formation. And what she really finds is that women's experiences and journeys look quite a bit different than what James Fowler has put forward. And so she kind of interviews these women and finds, she has one chapter on apophatic faithing, in which she's describing the way in which women often experience a sense of negation or loss or emptiness kind of on their way to a broader, more expansive theology, and kind of finding a new way of being in the church that feels more inclusive of their experience. It's a really excellent book.